Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And my guest today, I'm proud to say, is Thomas Gryta. He is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal and the co-author of a new book called Lights Out: Pride, Delusion, and the Fall of General Electric. Tom, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So I like to have guests introduce themselves. I find it to be less windy, right? I could give you a big buildup. If you don't mind, introduce yourself to our listeners, 30, 45 seconds. Tell us who you are.
Sure. I grew up in New Jersey, went to school at the University of Massachusetts, spent some time overseas, which sort of jutted me into journalism. I've worked for Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal basically my entire career, about 20 years. I've been all over the newsroom. I've been an editor. I've covered steel. I've covered biotech. I've covered telecom, and then industrials, which basically is the GE beat.
Gotcha. Well, great. Well, that was short and to the point. So I read your book and I quite enjoyed it. And I'll tip my hand in saying my first book was on Enron, now almost 20 years ago, Pipe Dreams. And reading your book had a bunch of parallels to the Enron story, a bunch, and I'll get into those. But let me start from the beginning and just ask you, what led you to write this book, and also to have a co-author, Ted Mann, on who can't join us today. But what was when did you know that you had to write a book about GE and how the company has fallen on hard times? When did you make that decision, and why?
I think it comes down to wanting to answer the question that we always get, which was, what happened to GE? When you tell somebody you write about GE for the Wall Street Journal, they're like, well, what happened? And we had written so many stories along the lines, and it had been sort of, breaking news around that. And there were just amazing stories. And it was this iconic organization. I mean, I just talked about the different industries I've covered, but it's like you almost couldn't not run into GE, it's just, they were everywhere. And I think, really intertwined with our culture. So Ted covered General Electric before I did.
And when did you start covering the company?
2017. So
3 years.
Spring of 20, 3 months before Jeff Immelt said he was going to step down.
Gotcha.
Which, when I took the job, people were like, he's been a CEO for a long time. This may happen when you're there. You don't know. It's sort of like the biggest event. Who's going to be the next CEO of GE? And sure enough, 3 months in, little did I know that would be sort of the least exciting event that would happen in the coming year.
And since then, GE's gone through, now on 2 other CEOs since then, now headed by Larry Culp, right? So we have two other people. I mean, we're not talking about Pacific Gas and Electric, where they change CEOs every couple weeks, but still,
right,
for a company that's been as solid as GE, to have that kind of changeover at the top is unusual.
Oh, yeah. I mean, very unusual, right? I mean, you would be CEO for decades there. I mean, they've only had, a dozen chairmen or something. I mean, it's
in 100 years.
Yeah, around 120, right? 125 years. It's shocking. And I think just thinking about GE's position as sort of a management icon, it's beyond shocking, right? How could this happen to them? And I think that all feeds into why we thought a book would make sense. We wrote this really long piece in the journal in December 2018 that really got into what went wrong. It was burned out, and it just felt like we could say more. And we knew the story so well. With Ted having covered it for me, he's based in DC, and we really worked together on a lot of this. And the book really is, we say the order of our names is alphabetical. I mean, it really was the two of us.
Well, it reads very easily, and surprisingly so on a book like this. Seems like it's a more of a personal kind of thing, and the fact that it's co-authored was interesting because it's pretty seamless. I mean, I don't see a change in tone, and it's really well written.
I mean, that's amazing. I'm really happy to hear you say that. I mean, that's so for us. So there's a lot of rewriting, obviously, getting that tone the same. I think Ted and I work very well together, so being eye to eye on it, and we've gone through this journey together. So I know it wasn't as difficult as it might seem, but
Sure.
for me, certainly the goal was to make it readable, right? It had to be. I just was, how many people are picking up a book about General Electric? I don't.
Sure.
Hopefully a good amount, but I wanted like my mother to be able to pick it up
Of course.
and
That's interesting.
understand.
It's interesting you say that,
What?
because when I think about how I write and what I write, I think of my mom. I want her to be able to understand it the first time. I don't want to have to explain it again. No, I want it has to be simple, but not too simple. But let me back up, because what you've written is in some ways a strange corporate history, in that here's an iconic company that's started by Thomas Edison himself, really, and then J.P. Morgan took it over, and Edison, sold his stock famously, and went on to other things. But you skip essentially 100 years of corporate history and pick up in 1981 with Jack Welch. So this is not the definitive history of GE. It's really the history of GE since Jack Welch. And I just looked at the stock chart, and a share of GE is now selling for about $10, which is the same as it sold for back in the early 1990s. So tell me just how quickly can you summarize what happened? Why did GE go through this meteoric rise and then fall to earth and not fail, not go bankrupt, but almost? What happened? What was, in the shortest possible sentence? How do you summarize what happened?
The shortest way is to say is hubris, right? I mean, it was, a series of bad decisions, resistance to change, this feeling of just being impervious to the forces that, corporations have to keep an eye on. I think, we're so big, we can handle it. You mix that with just the culture, the performance culture, the way people were driven inside, and then, we don't even mention the financial crisis or the financial aspect of that. GE was a bank with an industrial company wrapped around it, essentially going into the financial crisis. That was a huge period for them, and they got out of it, but I don't know if they really got out of it. They were really fully recovered from that.
And so if I could paraphrase what you're saying, and it was something that happened to Enron, it's happened to a lot of companies, the financialization of the business. Instead of sticking to the making, they manufactured profits. They financialized their business. So I want to come back to the commercial paper part of this, because that, sure, I think is really the interesting, you really lay it out very clearly about their ability to borrow on the short term and lend it on the long term. And that was essentially how they were making money as a bank that wasn't a bank, right? If I can summarize that. But Exxon, let me just back up, because to me, the stature of GE, it's on the Boston Celtics have it on their uniforms now, right? The meatball, they called it, right? That was so Exxon is of similar vintage to GE, but I can't think of another company that has as long a track record or has grown to such prominence as GE. Why was it so successful for so long? I mean, Exxon's falling on hard times now as well, but why was GE so iconic, and what made it so successful for over the course of a century?
I think they did manage to sort of reinvent themselves regularly. And I do think that they had, the CEO before Welch, was like a renowned CEO. Like, they have this history of just producing leaders in management. And I do think it was a well-managed company for a long time. It's also gigantic. I mean, the markets they were in, light bulbs, making the machines that make the power. A third of the planet's power is produced by GE hardware, right? The turbo.
That was one of the facts in your book that, I've studied. My latest book is on electricity, and that was the one that stopped me. I thought, wow, now that is market influence. A third of all the electrons distributed around the world today are coming out of General Electric machines in one way or another. It's stunning.
Yeah. I mean, jet engines, X-rays, and they played key roles in developing these technologies too. And that's their jet engine business is gigantic, and we can talk about what's going on with it now, but like, it's just, it's hard to sort of understand how big its presence is in so many different industries. And they really, they survived the sort of great washout of conglomerates, because they were exceptional. And I
Right.
think they're always seen as, well, it's General Electric. It's, it's like, they're almost like part of the government. I mean, it's just, they are America. And to your point, there are other big companies like that, but they stuck around for a really long time. And when you said before they didn't fail, they're still around. I think it's for the same reasons. I mean, they make big turbines and jet engines, and they still make those products, right? They didn't fully,
plastics and medical equipment and all kinds of other things,
right?
right? And
But like real products that people use and pay money for, and there's cash coming in the door. And it's, if you can, that doesn't mean you're going to be successful, but at least it's, kind of the first thing you need to set up a functioning business. And I think, they do have that, and I think that does help them.
Sure.
Help them survive.
So you're still covering, you've written the book, and which is, I don't know if there are other ones that are out that are this similar vintage, and your book came out in mid 2020, right? I think July. And is that right? And so, but
Yeah.
you're still covering the company. I mean, what's that like to have now written the book about this company, and you're still covering it? Is that awkward at all, or does it give you a leg up, give you credibility? How does that work?
Well, I don't know if it gives me a leg up at all. I mean, I think it's interesting to still be covering them. They are essentially a different company. I mean, they really are not. It's the company that we're writing about in the book is that Welch Immelt era, and we write about how all that sort of came tumbling down, and
which covers about almost 40 years, not quite 40 years, but four decades anyway.
Right. And as your point, it's by no means a definitive history of GE. We did write it pretty fast. We wanted to get the story out there. We wanted people to hopefully understand it. And there's of course more that you could write or more details, but yeah, I mean, I think it's, it's still an interesting story, but it's not, a lot of the people who are there aren't there. Even John Flannery, who came in immediately after Immelt and then was there for 14 months, he was really pushing hard to change the culture, and really the things he found, and he had thought for years about the problems he thought GE had, and how he would do it if he got that chance. And I think he was really, really pushing that. He just didn't, he either didn't really get the chance to do it, but you could argue that rethinking GE was never going to be able to be done by an insider. They needed someone to come in, and Larry Culp comes in, and he's doing essentially those same things in his own way. He's a very sort of regimented his processes.
Right.
But it really is a different. I could ask Larry Culp about Jack Welch or the culture of GE. It's just not. He's not part of that. Like it's a.
And he's the first, you jumped ahead because that was one of the questions I wanted to ask, because Culp was the first outsider, first non-GE person to lead the company in its history in 126 years, which came from Danaher Corporation, I guess, and if memory serves. And that in itself is a remarkable break. But let's go back in terms of, because you really cover it, as you said, the Welch and Immelt era, and GE was going, as I said before, goes back to the dawn of the electric age in America. So it's a pivotal company, but it really changed under Welch, who took over in 1981. And the obituary in the New York Times said that during his tenure, the market capitalization of the company went from 12 billion to 410 billion, and they called him a business superstar, and he was everywhere. The Neutron Jack, he became this celebrity CEO. Why was Welch so important, and what made him successful?
No, those are great points. Although I would say you should read the obituary from the Wall Street Journal first.
Okay. Spoken like a true Dow Jones man.
Right.
Okay, then.
No, but you're right. Like, how many CEOs who aren't founders,
right,
are like famous, right? Like how think of like Lee Iacocca. Like how many people that are actually talked about at people's houses or at dinner tables
that are managers that are managers and not owners. And I want to come back to that, because that I think is a critical point.
Sure. You know, that was Jack Welch, though. I mean, he was like larger than life. He came in from the beginning. He wanted to change. He wanted GE to move faster. He wanted to get away from the constant planning and sort of what he saw as the sort of more stodgy old ways. And he wanted to cut costs. He wanted to be efficient. He was there to make money and make the company as good as it could be. You know, I think Jack, you know, it's amazing to think of sort of Jack's position in the world in 1999 compared to now, where I think people question some of his, you know, the old rank and yank methods and some of that aggressive positioning, you know.
And rank and yank,
But
just to be clear, that was up or out, right? You had grading every year, and ExxonMobil still does this. Enron did this, and it created at Enron, I would argue, a very toxic culture. But I mean, that also created a very competitive culture as well. I'm just interjecting that, rank and yank, because I think that was the other part of his tenure that was controversial. No.
yeah, no, I think that's true. And if you asked, you know, obviously he has passed, but if you asked Jack about that, you know, he would tell you it was a great tool because they did so many deals, right? They're constantly acquiring companies, so they could go in and essentially clean up the place. But I think if that's going to be like the standing corporate policy, it could be really hard on the culture, and just you might be losing some good people. You know, so there was that, and then, you know, obviously the move towards financial services in the 90s, you know, really happens under Welch.
Right.
You know, it was very clear, you know, the people said that when he realized how easy it was to make money in financial services, like he couldn't believe it. Like it didn't, you know, after decades of selling products and cutting costs, and you're like, you can just sort of, right, we're running the company so well, people will lend to us at great rates, so we can just relend to sort of middle market people who aren't served as well and get higher rates.
And I think that's the key there, is because it was really the GE Capital, the rise of GE Capital, which eventually under Welch, if memory serves, I'm looking at my notes here, eventually starts to contribute half of GE's profits, which is just enormous for an industrial company that isn't a bank, and yet it became one of the biggest lenders in the world, and it was due to their credit rating. So, but was that really Welch's main achievement, or was there something else?
You know, I mean, the stock price went through the roof. I mean, how you want to look at achievements? I mean, there were, you know, factory workers on the line were millionaires because of the performance of GE's stock in these years. You know, it's a hard, like, where would GE be without Jack Welch? I mean, you know, Westinghouse isn't around anymore. I mean, there's a lot. It seems like it would have been hard for GE to survive without someone like Welch, right? Because, and we may
would have been acquired, or
well, we may get into this, right? But that, you know, conglomerates really only work when they're run by the right person. Like,
right.
Functionally, the theory of conglomerates is kind of not is debunked, right? It doesn't. But if you have the right person, if you have Warren Buffett, or if you have someone who, right? But like, that's hard to say it's because of the company and not because of the person,
of the leadership, and that's a critical point. Well, so I mentioned before we started recording that my first book was on Enron, and there are pipe dreams for all of you listeners out there. It's Greed, Ego, and the Death of Enron. It's still in print. You can still buy a copy.
Excellent.
But you mentioned Enron in your book, Lights Out. And by the way, just a quick reminder, I'm talking to Thomas Gryta. He is the co-author with Ted Mann, who couldn't join us today, of a recent book, Lights Out: Pride, Delusion, and the Fall of General Electric. But you make the point at several locations in the book about General Electric and the parallels to Enron. And one of them was the special purpose entity. What was the Edison conduit?
It was essentially this vehicle for, you know, putting the company could buy assets and mark them at low prices, sell them into a vehicle, which was an off-balance sheet entity, sell them at a higher price, record the gain, and use the asset to feed the conduit, which essentially issued commercial paper if that makes sense. I mean, it's sort of probably hard to explain briefly, but hopefully we do it well in the book.
You do.
But it's this idea that you're essentially doing deals in order to pump up your earnings.
And the key, I think, here is that phrase, the special purpose entity, which is the clear parallel to Enron, which, as Andrew Fastow went to jail for this, he was a CFO, but GE created a special purpose entities that they later had to reveal, I guess, in 2001, that the special purpose entities after in their 2001 annual report, that they disclosed that they had more than $55 billion of assets in such special purpose entities. So it was a way that Enron and General Electric both used to make their financials look better by creating this off-balance sheet entity where they could put assets, move assets, and appear to be more profitable than they were.
Yeah, I mean, I
excuse me.
I will just sort of caution to say,
sure, no, make it clear.
Being a
if I've not been completely clear,
being a reporter at the Journal, I just I think it was clear Enron was fraudulent, and there was a lot of self-dealing, and
sure.
Whereas I don't think Jeff Immelt, he wasn't in it for the money. I mean, it was not a there was different, I think there were sort of different incentives, but back then I do think, I think your point about some of the methods that were going on at GE and likely other companies were similar to things that companies like Enron did when you're sort of cooking the books. And then, of course, as you know, after that, a lot of the rules changed.
Right.
And so when GE
with Sarbanes-Oxley and
right.
But it was around this time that was kind of the Wild West. And it's interesting, I was looking at the new board of directors at GE. Leslie Seidman, who used to be on the Federal Accounting Standards Board, is now on the GE board. So presumably to have a look at the financials. But I one of the things I noticed too, in 1998, Arthur Levitt, who was then the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, famously said, accounting is being perverted. So how perverted it, we can argue about the degree between GE and Enron, but nevertheless, it was not being fully transparent in terms of the accounting. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and I think because of the rules at the time, there wasn't necessarily anything wrong with it.
Right.
Just the the level of disclosure that was required from companies wasn't there, and when some of these things came down, companies lost some of the tools they used to manage their earnings.
Right. Well, and that's the key, is that was what these special purpose entities and the way that that GE's black box accounting worked was that it allowed them to show this continuing growth, never in super stable earnings, and that this was Welch's hallmark, right? Was that they always delivered. And because they always delivered, like Enron always would manage to beat the forecast by a penny or two, right? It was always able to just meet the expectation or exceed them slightly. And that was the gold, and how the stock kept going up was because they never disappointed. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, they were, and it was sort of surprising it wasn't really hidden. I mean, Welch and even like Dennis Damerman, like they would talk about, of course you have to manage it. Of course you have to smooth them out, because no one wants to own a company that has erratic earnings from quarter to quarter. But it's like, well, that was then you're not really presenting reality, right? You're not showing the company as it is. You're smoothing out all its financials. So it's
well, and the other thing that comes to mind is that, well, we can explain it to you, but you wouldn't understand. Right. Or it was, which was the line that I got when I was covering Enron. Oh, well, we can explain it to you, but you just, you're too stupid. It's like, okay, well,
right.
You're probably right.
Right.
So let me talk about jets, because this is the other thing that jumps out in terms of the use of corporate jets. And you reported on this. I found your original story from 2017, which at Enron, there was a lot of abuse of corporate jets. There was a lot of abuse at Chesapeake Energy, by the way, as well. Huge fleet of corporate jets. But that you wrote in 2017 about how during Jeff Immelt's tenure, he would fly in a jet and then he would have another jet follow the original jet. And these weren't just little bitty Cessnas, where you have to duck your head to get in. It's a Bombardier Global Express. The operating costs, you said, well, I looked them up, $7,500 per hour. But according to your story, I think it was an additional $250,000 per trip. I mean, this is a level of extravagance and indulgence that is truly off the charts when it comes to corporate jets. And I've written about this a little bit. I mean, why was him out doing this? And then they found out about it, and he kind of brazened it out. Tell me that story.
That was a wild ride for sure. That was the story. We spent a lot of time on that story, as you can imagine. It wasn't thinly reported. We weren't going to go and say something like that unless we were really sure, and we had talked to a lot. We really understood what was going on, and the reaction. Of course, people were shocked, but the company itself, initially they denied it. Jeff denied it. They said it stopped in 2014. We did a subsequent story that showed it did not. That actually there were flights in 2017 that had backup planes. We did a great graphic of the two planes going around the world, and at one point we actually had pictures of the two planes. But it was shocking. And again, Jeff Immelt is not, and a lot of people would tell you, but that's not Jeff. I mean, he isn't this like chasing money, wants to have the best. I just think to some degree he didn't. Well, I don't know what he wanted, because he claims that he didn't know. Although there's plenty.
How could he not know?
Well, there's a lot of reasons to not. But I'm not going to get into that. But it was all about, he just needed to be where he needed to be, and he goes so many places he can't possibly be late for meetings, and if plane breaks down, you have to have a backup one just in case. It defies reason. I mean, it doesn't, heads of state don't do this. Like, nobody has a plane follow them around.
But it goes back to what you said earlier about hubris, right? That this was the way they operated, and well, of course, absolutely positively have to be there, so why not?
Yeah, but I think that Jeff thought of himself as like a head of state. I mean, he used to say he could have dinner with anybody once, right? That's what he used to joke. There was anybody in the world would have dinner with him because he's the CEO and chairman of GE. That might be true, but I think he really, the importance that sort of came with the job when Welch's prominence really blossomed. Jeff came into that, and he sort of inherited the throne, right? I mean, Jack did a lot, with the company, and it was already done when Jeff came in. Jeff inherited a lot of problems, and also caused some of his own, obviously. But
sure,
I think that's sort of that hubris, right? That self-important,
right? And that was the word I was going to hit you back with, because that I mean, it's in your title, it's implied in your title about pride, delusion, and the fall of GE, right? But that hubris, right? Greed. Well, it was in the subtitle of my book, Greed, Ego, and the Death of Enron, right? It was this greed. It was an overwhelming greed at Enron, no doubt about it. But it was also ego. Well, your portrayal. Let me go back to Welch, because there's one part of it that to me is something of a parallel to Enron, and then we can leave Enron aside. But Welch was paid, you report, about $1 billion over a less than a 20-year period, which is just a staggering sum. But you don't mention one of the other parts of the Welch story, which is the Susie Wetlaufer story. After he gets interviewed by her when she was the head of the Harvard Business Review, has an affair with her, then gets divorced, and it kind of tarnished his image, along with the other things that were coming out about the accounting right after his tenure at GE left. I'm just curious. It's a little prurient, I suppose. Ben Welch wasn't the CEO anymore, but that personal character issue to me seems relevant, and you didn't really write much about it. Why leave that part out? I'm just curious.
Well, I think you'll see we definitely had to sort of get through certain things quickly. I think we mention it.
Okay.
It was an ugly. You're right. It was an ugly time. It's not, how bad it was for the company itself and what it meant for the company, which is obviously our focus. Um, I think is hard. But I think you're right. It came out that Jack is going through this divorce, and it really, I think he miscalculated sort of how that would go, and when all the stuff, like all the perks he was getting, and they were
Right. Right.
paying for his apartment and this
And
and
it,
that.
and it all came out in part due to the divorce proceedings, right? That this, and
Right.
so it took a lot of the shine off of this, the image that he'd cultivated for more than his whole career, right? As this upstanding, tough Irishman, and instead it kind of came out, well, no, he's just kind of not who you thought he was, which to me was, disappointing on a personal basis, but it was also like, well, how different is this guy really?
Right. Yeah, and I think the counter argument would be like, well, the enormous shareholder returns under him, and he was a legend, and his book, he sold this book, it was like a record at the time.
Right.
He didn't even need. I think he gave it all to charity. I mean, um, he was enormously successful, and
Right.
it, so for that to come out, and for people that like, because it's like you're kind of like, why does he need someone to pay for his apartment? Like,
Yeah. And
like,
fresh flowers and this, that, and the other. It was, but anyway, so well, I don't want to belabor that point. Let me, how much of this of GE's failure? Now we've talked about Welch, we've talked some about Immelt, and Immelt also made a tremendous amount of money. I have it in my notes here. You said it was over $160 million, I think, during his tenure. Um, but how much of the failure of GE do you think is due to this celebrity charismatic CEO culture that we are in the midst of and have been in the midst of for a long time? How much of it is due to that?
um, I think what sort of trickles down from that, and that idea that like we are so great, right? Like we're so great that our leader is considered the most prominent businessman in the United States, and this
Been
company,
on the cover of Forbes, been on the cover of
right?
Fortune over and over. Yeah.
This company is bulletproof, and I think it's, we definitely get into this, the idea of like, wow, we did a bad deal, we lost $1 million. I mean, it's GE, we can handle it. But if, you can only do that so many times, right? I mean, anyone. There are limits, and I think they hit those limits pretty hard. With the financial crisis, and then the Alstom deal, and how they sort of unwound GE Capital and just essentially bought back stock. Um, there were a lot of missteps as far as like celebrity CEOs and that sort of.
The aura around them and the rest of it, that yeah, these guys are they're just smarter and better, and smartest guys in the room, right?
Right.
That's
Well, I
us.
mean, that was GE. I mean, that was certainly how they thought, right? They thought if they owned a company, it was worth more than if you owned it,
Right.
because they
And
owned
the same with
it.
Enron, right? And that was yeah, that same kind of hubris. But that was let me talk about, you mentioned the share buybacks, because this is one of the things that I thought was really remarkable. And of course, Welch wasn't the only one, and ML to buy back their own stock. Lou Gerstner was famous for this at IBM, buying back his own stock, right? And that was helped push up the share price, or rather earnings per share. But you point out that in around 2008, during the financial crisis, in 2008, the company had spent more than $3 billion buying its own stock, and in 2007, it spent $15 billion. Then you go on, you say over the entire period, GE paid an average price of about $37.50 for 500,000 shares, worth more than $18 billion. Now, in 2008, it would sell almost 550,000 shares back to the market for $22 a share in order to raise $12 billion. So they were selling back shares to the market at a lower price. It was wiping out more than twice the amount of cash that the deal that they'd done with Warren Buffett, who invested billions in the company. It was just, well, we bought the shares for a lot of money, then and then we had to buy them again, or we had to sell more shares, dilute the existing shareholders, and lose money in the process. It was truly one of the remarkable series of transactions.
It's almost like exactly what you don't do, right? I mean, Obviously buying back stock is, corporations do that. Obviously in the last few decades, it's gotten very big. Companies fund themselves using equity, so sort of repurchasing that is, that's fine, but you have to think about how you do it, right? I mean, you should be, think of yourself. If you have a mortgage or something, right? Like, when you're buying back stock, you're using the extra cash that you have, right? Like you're using discretionary. You don't like when it's like a mission and you're devoting capital so you can buy back stock. It's a little, and then also paired with the extra cash, the value of your stock has to be it has to be reasonably unvalued according to your
right
metrics, right?
if you're going to expend capital for it, it has to make sense in terms of value, right?
So buying your stock when it's up makes no sense other than that you think it's going to keep going up. I don't and GE didn't do that well. They just were buying back stock. And to do that just as like a policy, it really blew up on them. I mean, it just, it's hard to comprehend how much capital went out the door just to repurchase their stock, and then the stock plummets, and it's, they are strapped for cash and have to slash the dividend.
And then they issue more stock, which was remarkable.
Right.
Well, let me ask this question. So would General Electric have failed? Let me ask it a different way. How close do you think the company came to going bankrupt?
In the financial crisis?
Yes.
That's hard. We certainly talked to people who said they came very close. And even Immelt would tell, he sort of likes to tell war stories when he gives talks, and he would say how badly and how close they came. Now, you do have to kind of put like your realistic hat on for a minute, because again, GE makes all this equipment for power plants, jet engines. They make products for the military. I don't think they would be allowed to go under. Like, I just don't think. I do think they would have been either bailed out or someone would have rescued them, both because they do have real assets. They're worth owning at some price, right? I mean, it's not zero. But also I could see the government having interest and saying, wait a minute, like this is one of two major jet engine makers in the world, and it's the United States, and this is important for us to maintain this. And
so they were too big to fail.
We never got to that point, but I don't see how they could be allowed to fail like that.
Well, so let me jump back then, because we're talking about that the 2008 crisis, and this is when Immelt turns to Warren Buffett, who is the quintessential example of the owner manager, right? And he has a huge amount of his own money in the company, in Berkshire Hathaway. And he came in to rescue 2000. He bought $3 billion in GE preferred stock, collecting, I'm reading how you describe this, collecting $300 million in annual dividends, and also received the right to buy $3 billion in GE common stock for $22 a share for 5 years. Buffett has always had a reputation, and well deserved, having cash and being able to spot an opportunity. How important was Buffett's intervention then at that time for GE, not only in terms of the cash, but as a vote of public confidence?
I think it's the public confidence vote that really was what they needed and wanted. Of course, the cash, but I think they would have had ways to find cash. It's more about where the cash was coming from. More about that Warren Buffett sees something he likes, right? I mean, he's not, he turned down AIG. Like he is not just putting his money everywhere. Like he doesn't make crazy bets. He's known to be a very sharp guy, and he saw and gave his vote of confidence, which he's fully aware, to GE. And I think that there's a justification in that. Like in some ways it reminded the market that, like, wait a minute, this is a real company. Okay. They did not build their business on subprime mortgages or collateralized debt obligations. I mean, this is real assets, real people, real facilities, property, things that are worth money, and there's value. And I think
but GE at that time was in a cash crunch, that it was needed real money, and
right.
not to be able to borrow it, they needed cash, and
They need cash.
Buffett came to the table with a lot of cash.
And yes, and I think it's important to remember that in those times, in the financial crisis, where it's hard to put yourself back in that place of how crazy the markets were, and people were scared. So the idea that X company may not be able to meet its obligations was terrifying and sent people running. So the idea that GE may not be able to make it through, even a perfectly healthy company could start going into a spiral that crushes them, because the market is so scared and they're just running, and they know how big GE is, and they know to a reasonable extent that they have a gigantic financial services operation. And people long thought of GE Capital as a black box. And at times like that, black boxes are scary.
Right.
So I think having that vote of confidence from Buffett was huge. He was the reminder that, wait a minute, yes, I think, what did he used to say? He said, financial derivatives are weapons of mass destruction. Like, he clearly did not want to go into those businesses, but he saw it. I think he was communicating to everybody else. They're like, wait a minute, there's real value here.
Sure. Well, let me follow up then, because this is a good time to talk about the GE Capital and how it operated, and explain how they now I had to reread these sections a couple of times, and I'm not going to explain it. I'm going to let you do it. But that GE had a AAA credit rating. It could borrow capital at very low cost. So it was borrowing money in the short term and lending it long term. So and that was one of the weaknesses or vulnerabilities it had during the financial crisis. So and you explained it in terms of commercial paper, which is the term of art for short-term borrowing. Can you, as succinctly as you can, and I know you're a Wall Street Journal reporter, you've been writing about this for a long time. How did GE Capital work and how did it become such an important part of their business, GE's business?
Well, it all starts, I think it was in the 30s, where they started a financial services organization to help people buy appliances. Things are expensive and you have to afford them somehow. And GE saw an opportunity in helping customers do that. So that's not uncommon, right? I think I saw GM is now applying to become a bank. I think it's not uncommon that people, that companies would try to do that. So it was always there, and it really, it sort of grows in prominence. Obviously, funding a $60 million power turbine is a lot different than a microwave oven. But as it grows, they're feeding into these, they're searching for yield, right? They're looking for opportunities where the banks aren't. Like, they're lending to restaurant franchisees, and they're doing anything. They're there's almost like private equity stuff going on, where they're buying businesses and then taking a chance on them. If they fail, they would fix them up and resell them. I mean, it was in some degrees it was like a giant hedge fund where they were just sort of finding returns in all sorts of quirky ways. That being said, they're also like a very functioning bank, and they played an important role in lending. And they were, by a lot of measures, they were very good at what they did. But how many good banks have blown up over the years? I mean, I think it's they were not regulated.
And
and
Welch,
they were
and
regulated by the Office of the Thrift, or it was they were not regulated like other banks were regulated.
Welch wasn't a banker, and neither was Immelt, and so it wasn't something that they necessarily had great expertise in, but they understood the ability of it to make money. Here was the part that I thought was interesting. You talked about Bill Gross and his note on GE Capital and talking about it. You said that GE Capital was borrowing huge sums via short-term debt and commercial paper, then lending it out at higher rates for longer terms. At the time of Gross's attack, Bill Gross of PIMCO, Moody's reported that GE Capital's short-term debt, covering commercial paper and debt due within 12 months, totaled a stunning $127 billion, and only 24%, or $31 billion, was backed by bank lines, and that was the $31 billion was the only credit that GE had or could draw to pay off those short-term notes. So it was massively exposed in terms of this short-term paper, the commercial paper exposure, and yet it was kind of just glossed over, I guess, until Gross really pointed this out. Were there other people besides Gross who were looking at this and making these kinds of remarks, or was it only that he had the stature to make these observations?
Well, yeah, I mean, that again, Bill Gross talking about stature, and especially in those times, hugely influential, calling out GE. And it's not like it really changed much, but his point was a good one. They're issuing all this debt. They don't seem to be having anywhere near the cash requirements that other banks would have. And why does it have this rating? And I don't know what they're doing with their money. And I think he really had questions that were relevant, a long decades later. There were a few other people, I think, who were suspicious or questioning the model. There was an analyst at the time who had sort of poked around, and but it certainly was not something that was a popular
Sure,
stance.
sure. And it wasn't well understood by people unless they were really digging into the financials. And that was a similar story with Enron, right? And Immelt, as I think you pointed out, well, if our financial report or annual report has to be as big as a phone book, so be it, or something. He said that something to that effect, right? Well, yeah, it's complicated, and we'll reveal it all, but you're going to have to read 300, 400 pages or whatever it was, which most people just simply won't do.
Yes. And again, you go back to that GE, the meatball logo, the American icon. I mean, that helps a lot, right? They get the benefit of the doubt, I think.
Trust us. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, what is Immelt doing now? What is Welch died in March. Immelt has out of the company. I haven't heard anything from him. I didn't Google him. I haven't looked around. What is it? What's keeping him busy? Do you know?
He's, I don't suspect he's a big fan of our work, but so he's a partner at a venture capital fund. And I know just from talking to people that he does give speeches here and there, but like that he's really working with companies, like smaller companies, and helping them develop. And he's mostly based in California, as I understand it. And in fact, I've actually like heard some like good things about that. He's like, he's doing well, that like people are, that he's being helpful to like a lot of these companies and using his, his experience.
Sure.
But what specifically his plans are, and I would say, I think Jeff doesn't, I think Jeff thinks he had the right plan. He did the right things, and it just sort of went against him.
Right. And now he can do pretty much whatever he wants. I'm assuming, as you point out, he as a manager left the company with what was it, about $160 million, I think that. And you also point out that under Immelt, here it is, approximately $168 million between 2006 and 2017 alone. And the CFO and others were also handsomely paid. And you also point out that the number of cars that under Welch, top executives got cars fully paid for by GE programs started by Welch for about 125 executives, and Immelt expanded it to cover another 700, which was then killed by John Flannery. But it seems to me that's just it's not a jet, right? But it's also another perk that's expensive that is not essential to making the business work, but discards the notion of being very, being the importance of saving money, of being a conservative with the company's cash. But that's just my observation.
I think it's a good one. I think that's a good, like, right? Like, because it's like you didn't get a company car and it was like, okay, run it into the ground for 20 years. I mean, you got a new car every few years, and you would think of that as almost like more of a perk at a law firm that's really raking it in, right? You're like, wow, But from a big corporation like that, especially with some of the issues they had, and even like through the financial crisis, right? Like when they're talking about cutting costs and trimming fat, and it's sort of amazing that some of those things survived.
Sure. Well, so what, we talked about Larry Culp and the idea of the outsider being needed, but I want to go back to this idea of the outside manager versus the owner, right? And that Buffett, of course, is the singular example of the corporate boss who manages a conglomerate, but still has such a big ownership stake that he's not a short termer. Whereas the corporate manager culture is, well, he's going to come in and he's going to make as much money as he can. He's going to make the company look as good as he can for as quickly as he can, because he knows he's not going to stay. Right. So is that a reconcilable difference? I mean, we have this idea about, well, we can have professional managers and they can come in and run any kind of company or whatever, but is that an inherent conflict between the owners of the company and the professional manager? And if it is can it be resolved?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I don't,
Okay.
we can sort of, yeah, I know. I'm just thinking like we can sort of, corporate compensation in general is sort of pretty wild. And I think you're right. I don't think a lot, I don't know how common it is that the CEO is going in there and saying like, this is it, right? This is my chance. I'm going to fill the coffers as much as I can and
take a lot of risk.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, and even Jeff, 16 years as CEO, long career as an executive, he made about $160 million. Of course, that's an enormous amount of money, right? But in corporate America, it's not that uncommon. So,
right.
In some ways, if you're gonna attack that, you have to sort of attack the things behind it. And of course, the people say, well, if you don't pay that, people are going to leave. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
he's the best football coach. We got to have him, and we're going to pay him whatever it is because he's the best. Right. Yeah.
But I think you're right. Like inherently, like it's the incentives are there to do exactly what you're saying.
For the temporary manager to come in and do what he needs to do to jack up the price and get paid as much as he can, because he's not going to be there that long.
Right. Do whatever you can to make the numbers, get the bonuses. How much that happens, I don't really know. And I'll say, I mean, with Immel, he accumulated a lot of stock over his career and continued to buy even above and beyond. And he has never, even up until now, has never sold a share of GE. And he was always proud of that, right? His father worked at GE, like,
right.
He's made a lot of money, but I don't think it was a money game
for
him. But success can be just as intoxicating, right? I mean,
so let me ask a different question. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Tom. So what, and maybe, given your position, maybe you don't want to answer it. What corporate heads do you admire? Ones that are either active now or historically. You've written a book that's been very critical of some corporate bosses. Who do you think has done a good job either in the past or is it working now?
I'm going to pass on that question.
I'm
sorry. I am still a reporter. I still,
no worries.
I don't want to.
No, I get it.
To be honest, I haven't really graded, this person's great, that person's great. There's also about, people, you talk about founders and like the ability for someone like Fred Smith from FedEx to like start the company and then grow it and then evolve it through various stages. I mean, that's exceptional. I mean, that's like, that is.
And Jeff Bezos, the same. I mean,
right. I mean, whether you like
your manager, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have feelings about their companies or the people either, but just doing that, I think is a pretty amazing, right? Sam Wall, whatever, the people who like sort of start it and they grow it and are still, who still run it, is they're probably the hardest companies to actually then, be the successor at too.
Right. So let me shift gears a little bit and talk about the issue of ESG, because I just looked at GE's website and they're very big on environmental social governance and so on. Is this this is a broader question? Are we entering a new era in terms of corporate governance in America and around the world that is going to be, um, excuse me, more defined by the whole ESG rubric? Is that, how do you see that playing out, or is that something else that you'd rather not rather not discuss?
No, I mean, we've written about it a little bit. I don't have like strong feelings about it one way or the other. I do think it's, it's driven by this idea that stakeholder value versus shareholder value, right? Like it's not, should getting that extra penny of EPS be the primary goal of the corporation? Some people argue yes, right? But then there's this other idea of like taking into account everything that the company does and having a more sort of wholesome view. And I think that's where the sort of the ESG, and I think that is happening, right? I mean, Jamie Dimon wrote a big letter that was famously sort of breaking that out,
And BlackRock has made
yeah, I
a
mean, I think
big
that,
deal about this, and I think it's stronger in Europe than it is in the U.S. right now. But it seems like it's going, the trends that appear to me, particularly looking at this from the energy side. Sure, the pressure seems to be growing and quite significant.
yeah, I mean, I think it's this acknowledgement that people care about what they're investing in, and they want, they're more concerned that companies are doing the right things. I don't. It's certainly an area, and I think like before the pandemic, for sure, it's certainly an area of discussion.
Right. Sure.
How
So
you should.
let me just have just a couple more things. My guest again is Thomas Gryta. He's on Twitter at Gryta. I said Thomas Gryta. T Gryta, Tgryta on Twitter. His new book, along with Ted Mann, is Lights Out: Pride, Delusion, and the Fall of General Electric. I'd like to ask my guests in just a couple more things.
The great Christmas gift.
I'm sorry, say again.
Great Christmas gift.
Absolutely, great Christmas gift. So what are you reading now? I know that you're a reporter and writer. What authors do you admire, and what business writers? Which business writers do you admire? What's on your nightstand?
Oh, that's a tough one. I admire. I have a lot of colleagues that I have to be honest. Like working at the Wall Street Journal, I'm in awe of constantly. I mean, Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, like he came out of the Journal, like it's some of that amazing reporting. I mean, I wouldn't get, people to people, but like, so many of my colleagues have written great books this year, whether it's about, the college scandals or housing, or it's really humbling. And I do try to support and read their work. I mean, it's staggering. And I love being, in the Journal newsroom. I think it's just an amazing place to sort of cultivate all those ideas. But there's obviously, there's other sort of classic books out there. Barbarians at the Gate, obviously everybody would mention that. Jim Stewart is brilliant. I mean, but to be, I don't, I like reading about, histories, like for this book, it was fun to read a bunch of books about Thomas Edison, because,
Sure.
He's a fascinating guy, and it was interesting to sort of learn about his role, or JP Morgan or Villard, or all these sort of early founders and their own, financiers. But I think, then.
That's good. That's good. You
Yeah.
don't want to beat it to death. So last question then for you. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope?
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a deep question.
It's okay. I'm hitting you with a lot of hard questions. It's
not
okay.
human, right? I mean, humans inherently good, but my children, seeing their world and how they look at it, and the questions they ask, and how they think about things, and I can see just in my own life how things have, our lives, right? Anybody's life today, life has changed so drastically just over the course of our lives. And, to see people entering the world, and my oldest is 10, my youngest is 6, to sort of be that place in the world, and like, wow, like you're coming into this world where it's so different, you know, like trying to describe
You didn't know the world that didn't have an iPhone.
right, or just trying to describe them like not that long ago in the big scheme of things, of like, you know, when I was in school traveling through Europe or something, and it was like you send a letter, you know, I try to call home on like a calling card or something, but like it blows their mind, like what, you know, like it's so I mean I think that gives me like seeing humanity's ability to sort of adjust and solve problems, that gives me hope. um
That's a
yeah,
good answer.
it's just a final question, you know, do you think people are good or bad, and you think, you know, ultimately let's all try to leave this place better than we found it.
That's a good way to stop right there. Uh, Many thanks to my
Well,
guest, Tom. Go ahead. You have something
no,
you
thank
want to add?
you. Thank you. No, thanks for thank you for us on. You know, Ted would love to be here. Unfortunately, he couldn't. He had a family issue, couldn't make it. But
No problem. Well, I'll mention Ted. He's on Twitter as well, at TMannWSJ on Twitter. The book is Lights Out, Pride, Delusion, and the Fall of General Electric by my guest, Thomas Gryta and Ted Mann. It's available at all major retailers, so by all means, buy a copy. Tom, many thanks for your time today. It was great fun. Congratulations on the book. It very readable and brisk, I would say, brisk reading about one of the most interesting companies in America. So congratulations on that. And all of you in podcast world, thanks for tuning in. This is the Power Hungry Podcast. If you like it, rate it on your favorite podcast platform and make sure and tune in for the next edition of the Power Hungry Podcast. Thanks.